Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining from or if you're catching the replay. And welcome to our last ZTNA Table Talks webinar of the year. I'm Mixa Gerard from the marketing team here at AppGate, and I'm happy to have you with us today for this discussion on Zero Trust Network Access. Before we dive in, just a few quick housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and you'll receive the replay within 24 hours. Feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A panel. If we don't get to them during the live discussion, we'll follow up afterward. You can also request translated captions from the menu panel. If you'd like to use that feature, just let us know so we can enable it for you. Now let's get into today's topic, why managed security must evolve beyond VPNs. I'm thrilled to be joined by four fantastic speakers today. Andy Mineker, CEO at IronCore, John Newman, CTO at Continuity Focus, Robert Ungema, our expert sales engineer here at AppGate, and moderating today's session, we have Corey O'Connor, VP of Product Marketing here at AppGate. With that, let's get started. Corey, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ixta, and thanks to everybody joining today's session. We've got a great session today. Before we get into it, I wanted to give Andy and John just a quick moment to provide a bit more context on their respective businesses so you can get a little bit more of their perspective as we go through today's material. So Andy, if you want to just say a few words and then hand it over to John, and then we'll get started.
Sure. My name's Andy Mineker. I am one of the co-founders at IronCore. We started in 2008. We are an MSP that is focused on financial institutions. So that's banks and credit unions.
John, over to you, bud.
Hi, I'm John Newman. I'm the CTO of Continuity Focus. We were founded in 2007, and our mission is really to help clients align technology risk with their appetite for risk. And our clients are pretty diverse in nature. And ultimately, our goal is to help them have a good understanding of what drives risk for their organizations and make decisions that they're comfortable with in terms of risk posture and outcome.
Great. Thanks. So before we get into it, I want to give the audience just a high-level overview in terms of what we're planning on covering today, so you can navigate through the talk track here. So we're going to start first with some market observations, what's changed in the market. We're then going to highlight some of the real-world challenges associated with VPN solutions. We'll pivot and talk about a better way forward with Zero Trust. We're going to touch on some of the business impact and MSP economics, and then we're going to close out with some practical advice and guidance for getting started for MSPs. So again, thanks to the panel for joining today's session. Let's go ahead and get started again on market observations. Andy, let's start with you. Why are MSPs telling us that trust and legacy remote access is breaking? What's changed in the last year that's really pushed the conversation forward?
I think it's the myriad of SSL, VPN, and VPN exploits. The pretty consistent, it seems like week over week, some UTM vendor is having an issue there. And I think it's making enough news that customers it's finally making it to that customer level.
Yeah. John, let's go to you for the next one. When did you personally feel that the tipping point when VPN stopped being good enough for your operation?
So about 5 years ago, there was a series of supply chain compromises. And I think at that point, we really started trying to figure out how to de-risk our portfolio. And SSL VPNs were a part of that process. And I think, one of the things that we've seen change over the last several years is the timing between when a vulnerability is a 0-day and there's targeted exploitation to when it's discovered and there's a series of really high velocity mass exploitations. And that for us, we saw that as too big a risk to continue to have in our service offering. So we didn't want to be the component that was the cause of the failure. And at that point, we decided to transition to a remote access strategy that we felt created less risk for us and for our clients.
Can I add to that? I really think that AI, and you can read the studies over the last 2 years, that AI is turning one day or O day stuff into exploits so much quicker than everything else that the attacks are, I mean, there's not going to be enough time to patch attack surface in the future, I don't think. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's the velocity of the weaponization of a vulnerability is increasing, and I think that the best way to reduce and manage that risk is through attack surface mitigation.
Yeah, and back to Andy's point, I mean, with the it seems like a regular cadence of CVEs for VPNs, right? So there's a pretty well understood, idea that VPNs just are no longer secure. And when we talk about secure remote access, especially in things like critical infrastructure, right? When you look back at the what was the attack that impacted the telecom industry?
Salt typhoon.
Right. And when we look at critical infrastructure, a lot of these operational technology environments still have a VPN, right, for remote access. And the SANS top 5 ICS and OT controls has secure remote access listed there. And I think if you're not taking a more of a proactive approach to securing those environments, John, to your point, you're going to be in trouble. So let's talk about how customer expectations have changed in the last, say, 12 to 18 months, especially around things like transparency, uptime, and proof of security.
I think regulation eventually comes for us all. It comes for the financial services business pretty quick, but you're seeing it with CMMC, you're seeing it with PCI, and frankly, I think cyber insurance is probably going to drive this harder than just about anything else for the non-regulated industries.
Yeah, I agree, and I've seen cyber insurance questionnaires that specifically mention remote access platforms.
Yeah.
Wanting to know what products are in use and how they're maintained.
Yeah. If you're not being proactive in terms of your security posture, certainly complying with some of these industry standards and regulations is going to be a big driver for any security. So let's dive a bit deeper on some of the pains and the challenges associated with VPNs. I know we've touched on it in the market observation section, but let's talk about some of the real world pains here. So do you guys, John or Andy, do you have a real example where, say, a legacy VPN really created risk, resulting in downtime or just, general issues or noise for your business?
I will say when we used UTM platforms as a VPN, the amount of effort that it takes to keep those up when there is that forward-facing or outward-facing vulnerability, our guys were working, nights and weekends, frequently getting things emergency patched because of these kinds of issues. So it's been very good from a technician engineer perspective. They certainly love this a lot more than they like patching UTMs.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's fatiguing, to have to prioritize remediating a forward-facing 0-day on a regular basis across customer infrastructure. It gets old, and I think it gets old for the service provider, and it gets old for the customer.
When we look back to those challenges, right, it seems like there's some operational challenges there. How do these VPN issues typically show up? Is it ticket volume? Is it scalability limitations? We talked about patch. Is it patch fatigue? Can you guys shed some light there?
For us, it was patch fatigue.
Yeah, I would say that. I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
No, I think that was, patch fatigue. I think also there are, the AppGate architecture has some performance advantages from a direct routing standpoint. So I think, from a user experience perspective, there's been an improved user experience, but from a operational standpoint as a service provider, it's largely the patch fatigue. The, drop everything and go patch your remote, your perimeter 0 day, that has to move to the front of the list of priorities. And it's fatiguing to have it at the cadence that it has happened. So, sorry.
Yeah, agreed. Yep, that's exactly our experience too.
Great. From a customer's perspective, they assume the MSP has this covered, right? How often do VPN vulnerabilities become your problem instead of the customer's?
Always, 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the S in MSP, is that the MSP is trying to be proactive and take ownership of the management of these platforms. It shouldn't be the clients coming to the MSP saying, "Hey, can you patch our firewall?" The MSP should be going to the customer and saying, "Hey, there's a vulnerability, we need to address it." So I think, to answer your question, yeah, I agree. It's always, and that's as it should be. That's the nature of the job.
Yeah. Great. So let's now talk about a better way forward with Zero Trust. So can we walk through maybe your first step into Zero Trust? Was there any sort of triggering event that sort of got you started or sort of lit the fire there?
John, do you want to take this?
I mean, sure. I think, for us, we've always been focused on least privilege and attack surface mitigation. So, Zero Trust is, I think, a way of framing those characteristics and unifying them under a model. So I think, for us, really what changed in terms of our capabilities with AppGate, it was less around the least privilege. It was more around the conditional access and the flexibility in building conditional access models that were tied really in a granular way. So, I think that, we never had the, VPN gets you to everything everywhere, but the ability to tie specific endpoint configurations, specific posture inspections to individual resources, that was something that the capabilities of the AppGate platform opened up in terms of our ability to be more granular with policy.
Yep. Exactly. I think certainly VPNs can be the starting point for moving into a zero trust architecture or adopting a zero trust strategy. But John, to your point, least privilege has been around even before zero trust. So VPN is certainly a good starting point. But when you look at a solution like AppGate around the granularity, identity-centric access controls, the conditional access, you can get really specific in terms of providing and revoking access to all the different users within your environment. John, you talked about architecture not too long ago. When you looked at ZTNA, some of the vendors in the space, how did architecture factor into your decision when you look across the market and see some of the alternative architectural approaches to providing secure access? We talked about direct routed, or you touched on it quickly. Can we talk about how much of a factor that played into your decision?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the flexibility of the AppGate platform for us was really a strong driver, because I think, what we're trying to do is take a platform and align it to a customer's technology and business requirements. So the flexibility of the platform really either constrains or enables that process to be done. So what we have in terms of our architecture is, we host the controllers and then we put gateways at client sites. So, clients can have a better user experience because their traffic is directly routed to them. It doesn't have to go through us first. They may have traffic that comes to us, but really the efficiency of the platform from a user experience standpoint is that your traffic doesn't have to go any place it really doesn't need to. And we've seen a lot of user performance issues with the hub and spoke model where you might have a user on the West Coast, VPN concentrator on the East Coast, in a resource, in AWS, Oregon. And that traffic is traversing the country several times. It's just not a good user experience. So I think for us, the components of AppGate and our ability to deploy them how and where we thought they should be deployed to optimize resiliency and user experience, for us that was a big benefit. And it was not, we didn't see a lot of platforms that could do that. So
yeah, I'd like to add one of the things that I always kind of question about outsourcing this to a cloud-based one is now you've added another critical vendor that can look at it has to be able to decrypt, it has to be able to decrypt the traffic in order to do things. So now you've just given a third-party vendor potential clear text access to PII. So it's another vendor management hurdle that we have to get over when we add a cloud-based ZT or a cloud-based platform.
Yeah, it's sort of complicating the shared responsibility model in the cloud, or adding an additional responsibility on the customer side by pulling in another vendor, like a cloud hosted vendor. So Andy, let's continue on in the next one. So we talked about identity centric policy enforcement. How important was that alongside device posture in your evaluation? And think about where maybe the VPNs didn't cut the mustard.
Yeah, most UTM-based built-in services are severely lacking. They're kind of an afterthought of the UTM part. So there's just not a ton of flexibility. And when a vendor does give you more flexibility, they tend to charge you for it. But anyway, as far as the posturing was huge for us. I wanted to put NAC everywhere. And anybody who's been working in the business long enough knows that traditional NAC is hot garbage and a pain in the butt to keep and maintain. And this has been a breath of fresh air. It just works incredibly well. We're able to posture security software, patching, all of these things, among other kind of unique things to our services where we want to make sure you're running certain things or you're part of a certain network or whatnot. So that's given us an amazing amount of flexibility for that.
Yeah.
The other thing that we're using it for is like a CASB kind of. So it's allowed us to lock down cloud services more and tunnel people through the AppGate so that they can only come from those IPs, and that sort of again limits attack surface on your cloud platforms. So again, this has been helping us not just for cloud platforms but legacy platforms. I don't know, anybody who's in banking knows everything's super old, so that has no modern authentication, anything. Well, we can put an AppGate in front of that and now bolt on MFA, bolt on posturing, bolt on all of these things to legacy platforms. So I tell the staff this all the time, AppGate is our Swiss Army knife for security here. We can do so much with this.
Yeah, I think not to get on my high horse here, but the sort of flexibility and openness of our platform is really beneficial to organizations that have those really complex, larger scale network infrastructures, right? It doesn't always have to be that way, but it works with legacy tech. If you got stuff on mainframes, if you're, the typical hybrid environment, it's really, again, flexible to meet your needs there. And I think when you talked about NAC and CASB, I think AppGate is really well positioned when you say Swiss Army knife to deprecate some of the overlapping access tools, but also maybe lower the reliance on some of these solutions that you have in place that you don't want to rip out, but maybe you don't necessarily want too many of those those workloads or those solutions within the environment, so it lowers your reliance on some of those other technologies. So um, let's talk about when you made the switch. It sounds like John made the switch very early on and didn't wait for the VPN opportunity to move to Zero Trust. But let's talk about when you moved over to AppGate, or to more of a Zero Trust approach. What was some of the things that surprised you most? Was it, the UX or the user sentiment? Was it the reduction in access related tickets that maybe came through? Onboarding speed? What were some of the things that surprised you the most?
For us, user performance. We have some very performance sensitive users, and we started. We actually, as we had some clients participate in our proof of concept, and we had some of our more sensitive users help test AppGate with us to see what they thought of the direct routed performance improvements. And I think that was the thing that was the most surprising. Architecturally, the product did what we expected, and we had good answers to the questions that we had. But I think having users that are very latency sensitive, have positive feedback on a remote access product, that's just not something that happens all that frequently. So I think that was probably our biggest, pleasant surprise with our transition to AppGate.
Yeah, surprising for us too. I mean, even from a normal traditional VPN perspective, our customer end users were noticeably surprised how much better things ran through this, especially terminal sessions and things like that. It was noticeable from a traditional VPN, the performance of the AppGate platform.
Yeah, we have a lot of remote desktop, and we have latency sensitive services, and I think it's hard to predict user sentiment on a remote access product, but the sentiment that we've had has been largely positive, and I think that a lot of that comes down to just engineering and the fact that packets they're not going places they don't need to go. Whenever you add latency and extra hops, you add more complexity and risk and opportunity for problems.
Yeah. Yep. Andy, let's go back to you on the next one. How did ZTNA change the relationship between you as the MSP and your customers?
I think top of the list would be it allowed us to change the conversation to a risk conversation. When we started talking about ZT, we had to explain kind of our work, why we thought it was important. So we got to start talking about risk. And as soon as we started talking about risk, the customer's ears start perking up. That's a language they understand. So Zero Trust helped us sort of foster that conversation easier than it normally would be.
Let's continue on the topic of Zero Trust. What, if any, misconceptions have MSPs had around Zero Trust? I know Zero Trust has been around for a while, sort of started out as like a trendy marketing, marketing terminology. But when you look at some of the frameworks and standards that have come out that are really rooted in Zero Trust and the pillars within Zero Trust, let's talk about some of the misconceptions on the MSP side of things.
I will say that one of and I hear this from fellow MSPs often, is that Zero Trust is a buzzword created by marketing to sell products. It's all just something that's all technologies that we've all put together, which is somewhat true, but it's put together in a meaningful fashion as a template for you to iterate upon. And that actually leads me to the other thing, is that it's not an all or nothing technology. You start and you continue to iterate through. For us, we started with ZTNA because the network touches everything that we do nowadays. So we figured we're going to start with Zero Trust on the networking side. We've iterated into application allow listing and continued to do that, but we started with ZTNA, and that was a great place for us to start because it allowed us to apply principles to things that weren't necessarily capable of uh, attaining those goals without something like an AppGate, some older platforms,
Yeah.
just things like that.
Yeah, I think like anything, it's one of those things where you just take sort of that risk-based approach and you maybe start with areas that are going to reduce the most amount of risk first and then scale it out from there, right? You don't want to boil the ocean. I think starting with ZTNA, Andy, to your point, is a naturally a good place to start. But you don't have to overcomplicate it. Again, you can scale it out over time.
Yeah, I really think, I agree with what Andy said around it's not binary. It's not all or nothing. It's a philosophy for how to manage risk. And I think every organization is on a journey towards that. And how fast you go and the order, those are dependent on the organizations, but it's not that, one day you flip the switch and now you're zero trust. And before you weren't. It's a process. And I think that makes it more that makes it less intimidating when you realize you go in stages.
And I will say, doing it as a VPN replacement and getting the infrastructure established for your customer allows you to make that conversation easy, because when you iterate, say, now I want to segment all your networks and not allow anything to talk to each other without traversing the ZT platform. Now you've already got the infrastructure there. It's not as big of a lift for them. They already understand the client. Nothing changes for them as far as they're concerned, as long as you're doing your job right. So I like that we put the tools there for the future.
Yeah. And I think you guys have touched on this. It's a journey, right? I think I heard at one point over the years somebody describe zero trust as a place that you never quite fully get to, but it is a continual effort to get closer to true zero trust, which I like that description. Let's talk about some of the business impact and some of the MSP economics. So this is a little bit of a trickier one, but did zero trust help retain customers or say win new business for you guys? And do you have any specific examples around that?
I don't have specific examples, but I think it kind of comes down to, when we sit down and we talk to a prospective customer, we're not starting a conversation about technology. We're not telling them that we have this product and it's great and this is why it's great. We're trying to understand their business. We're trying to understand the risks that they are sensitive to, the risks that we see for them that we think they should be thinking about. And in that process, I think is what differentiates, organizations that are working really in the risk management business versus organizations that are working in the, IT problem solving business. And, a lot of MSPs are really focused on, how do we fix a client's problem as quickly and cost effectively as we can so that the client is happy and the MSP is scalable. I think that's just a different model than an organization that's really trying to help clients manage and reduce risk. And I think that to me, that's it's a perspective and it's an approach. And I think that, some clients really appreciate that and they differentiate towards service providers that are more risk centric in their thinking and process, and others that's not really what they think they need as an organization, and they tend to be more aligned with a MSP that's just more kind of operationally focused on break fix and desktop support and things like that. That's my thoughts on it. I don't know, Andy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had from a retention side of things, it's certainly helpful because once we've done a adequate job of explaining the value and the risk mitigation, when they've looked at other clients or MSPs that don't do it, they're now wondering why they're not doing it, because we've done a good job of explaining how we're using it to mitigate their risks.
Let's talk about some of the operational or cost benefits after moving away from a VPN. Andy, do you want to shed some light
Sure.
on your experience there, maybe in terms
Well,
of maintenance and ticket volume?
yeah. Well, the maintenance, I love AppGate's maintenance because everything is so laid out. Generally, I don't know if anybody's patched UTMs and clusters and things like that. Some of them do a really good job of managing that, and some of them don't. And AppGate does an amazing job of when we do an update, it pushes out iteratively throughout the entire customer base, and it's taking into account HA and things like that. So we can do these things with zero customer impact or minimal customer impact. On top of that, we're not doing it every week. So that's certainly saved us a lot of time.
Yeah, I concur.
Not to not to speculate too much here, but let's say that you guys were still relying on VPNs. What do you think would have happened within the last year if you hadn't moved off of those solutions and over to a ZTNA solution?
I'm not. I'll tell you one thing I know for sure is the pitchforks would be coming out from the engineering team because they're tired of dealing with this stuff. From a customer's perspective, I think they never don't have availability into that platform. And when we're doing UTMs and things like that, that's often the case. Is we've got to have patch windows and there's got to be downtime. People are going to lose availability for a small amount of time. And if we're doing this frequently, it's made a big, it makes an impact. So the fact that even if AppGate had a 10, it's not on the internet. Nobody can see it on the internet. So if we have a CVE 10 and it's on the internet, we can take a second and figure out what's going on. Where if it's a UTM and a CVSS 10, we got to do that night. We got to get that done immediately. So there's just that attack surface thing has just been a huge boon for us. Plus, I think attack surface is kind of the front lines anymore. And so it's the engineering team has been far happier dealing with AppGate, even on the client side too, because the client works really well. The posturing works really well. The interface we have the interface so it can show what didn't meet posture, so we can help customers get over those humps really, really easy. It's been a really nice platform. We've gotten a lot of value for very little effort with it, which is something that's not common in our space generally.
Yeah. Which needs to be that needs to be the reality, right? For any security vendor that's providing a solution, is you need to get real value from it and enable the success of your team and make things easier for them, right? Let's go to the final segment here around some of the practical guidance and advice that we can provide to the MSP audience here. So it's sort of continuing on from the last question around VPNs. For the MSPs that might still be using a legacy VPN, what's the first thing they should do in terms of understanding their exposure and maybe evaluating and identifying what their risk exposure is?
I think, looking at what the kill chain from a remote access platform compromise looks like, I think understanding that, thinking about what the incident response process should look like, understanding what the blast radius is. I think to me, this starts with understanding how the platform that's in place could go wrong and what the implications of that are for the MSP and for their customers. Yeah. And if they can de-risk that implementation to the point that everyone can tolerate the risk, then the platform might be viable for them. If they can't, then I think it's time to look at alternate platforms that inherently have better engineered risk mitigations. But I think it just comes down to, can they accept the risk? Can they understand it? Can they accept it? And if they can't, do something.
Yeah, and I think from John said it pretty much right away, is attack surface mapping. Do some attack surface mapping. If you haven't done that, start doing some attack surface mapping. And in my opinion, your UTM and firewall is the worst place to have a vulnerability because it touches everything on your infrastructure. So the more we can de-risk that UTM and firewall appliance, the better. But the more we're doing with attack surface management, it will become obvious to MSPs where the bodies are buried and where we need to start putting protections up.
Yeah, I mean, I think architecturally, you're right. A perimeter firewall exposing a web server to the public internet, like architecturally, that is a pretty high risk decision because every web server that I've ever encountered has vulnerabilities. The question is, who knows about them and when? So I think, taking a perimeter firewall and opening up a web service to the public internet, it's a risk decision. And I think some organizations will be comfortable with it. I know personally we were not.
Actually, this is a good segue into the next question. What questions should SMBs be asking their MSP to determine whether they're truly protected?
I would probably be asking my MSP how they're aligning me to a cybersecurity framework.
Yeah.
How am I aligned and where do I sit? Am I CIS 18 level 1? Am I 60% there? Am I through level 1 and I'm 50% through level 2? I would be asking my vendors, how are you judging this and how are you iterating this, and prove it to me. Prove to me that my risk is going down. Show me that I'm expanding.
Let's again, you guys are some grizzled vets here, right? Let's talk about maybe one or two things that you wish you had known before going through this call it modernization with ZTNA.
I'm not sure. I think we did a really good job of doing our proof of concepts. We worked with the AppGate folks to make sure all of the use. Matter of fact, I spent hours with the AppGate folks trying to stump them on different use cases to see if this would fit in. And like I said, it's been a Swiss Army knife for us. I haven't been able to stump those folks yet. So it's been pleasantly a simple journey as far as the technology goes. It's really winning hearts and minds with the customer and helping them understand the risk. That's probably been the hardest part of the journey.
Yeah. And this is sort of a leading question and shouldn't be too much of a commercial for AppGate, but let's talk about, maybe one of the lowest risk ways that an MSP can get started with zero trust without ripping out their entire stack. And I sort of touched on AppGate coexisting alongside other technologies, and it doesn't have to be necessarily about AppGate ZTNA, but I don't know if you guys can provide some guidance around a lower risk way to get started.
I think you can run it in parallel. Some VPN clients will not coexist on a host, and they get very temperamental when you have more than one installed. We have not found issues with AppGate coexisting with other VPN clients. So an MSP can test it, can run parallel, can use it internally. I think using a technology before you try to present it to a client is a good practice. Get comfortable with it, get operationally confident with it before you have it in production for a client. And I think, it's fairly straightforward to run in parallel with other remote access platforms. And I think, the other thing that I'll say about AppGate, we have a lot of questions when we look at a product. We have a lot of, security architecture and engineering and due diligence questions. I think, I'd encourage organizations to ask their questions. And, to me, that's a lot of the hallmarks of a good partner is they welcome those questions and they're excited to answer them, and the answers are thoughtful and useful. Some prospective partners are pretty irritated when you start asking them security engineering questions. And, their answer to that is, well, it's good enough for fill in the blank large logo, so it should be good enough for you. And to me, that's not an answer that is satisfying. So I think, my suggestion for MSPs and really anybody sourcing a technology is, look for the willingness to answer, thoughtful questions with thoughtful answers. And, that's a good predictor of culture and of the level of effort that's gone into security engineering versus, some organizations put more effort into marketing and sales and less into actual security engineering.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, John.
I would add, if eat your own dog food. So first customer on AppGate as an MSP should be you and your techs, your engineers. You should be using this product internally so you understand all of the use cases, all of the nuances. That's going to give you a much better, dictionary on how to talk to the customer about use cases and about benefits and things like that.
Great. Yep. All right. So last and final question. Would you say the shift away from VPNs is ultimately about technology or restoring trust between MSPs and their customers?
Ooh. I'm not going to answer that question directly, but what I will say is that many customers don't recognize the risk of traditional VPNs. So it's really on us to explain that. And if we don't explain it and there is a compromise, we will be blamed. So from that perspective, maybe not a restoring of trust, but a salve or a saving trust, so that we're still the trusted advisor because we didn't give bad advice. We were ahead of the game for you from a risk and a technology perspective.
Yeah, I agree. It's risk reduction is reputation preserving. And I think, that's to be able to have candid conversations with customers, both in good and in not great situations. Ultimately, we want the decisions that we make to be defensible, and we want them to understand that we made decisions with thoughtfulness and with their best interest at heart. And I think that that's where, if you have a product in your portfolio that is higher risk and it, and there's alternatives that are available that reduce those risks and you choose not to use those, at some point, you may have to explain that decision. And I think that that's where there's a lot of opportunity for that trust erosion, because it's hard to explain why you knew you had a problem, but you did nothing.
Yeah. Yep. So that's a great point.
Cyber insurance has been pretty helpful at increasing our customers' vocabulary with risk and cyber risk. So they're asking more and more questions, which is great. And I think that's a positive thing. It helps with, as long as we can answer those questions, I think it helps with trust.
Yeah, those questionnaires are getting longer and more detailed over the years.
It's good. It's good because it takes customers who have not had regulatory pressures for maturity, and it helps them understand that they can't just transfer all of their risk to an insurance provider, that the insurance provider wants them to take steps to reduce those risks, and it helps facilitate the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Compliance drives security in that regard, right? All right. Well, I just want to thank Andy and John for joining today's session. Eeksta, I'm going to turn it back over to you to take some of the Q&A from the audience.
Sounds great, Corey. Yes, we have a question that came in. Did ZTNA allow you to simplify infrastructure by reducing reliance on hardware gateways, concentrators, or jump boxes?
Jump boxes, yes. Concentrators, yes. Hardware, we're still using hardware to do network segmentation. But I think as we iterate, the gateways can do that segmentation by themselves as long as they're connected to all those networks. So it's really just a kind of a risk analysis that we'll need to do before we could get rid of some of the other filtering appliances like your internal firewalls and things like that.
Yeah, I think the ability to run the components in a virtualized, fashion to us, there's a lot of flexibility that comes with that. We're not getting rid of hardware firewalls anytime soon, but I do think that being able to have the benefits of virtualization in terms of DR, snapshotting, there's operational benefits that we have by having the components virtualized, and I think that's been helpful for us.
Thank you, John and Andy. We got another question here that came in. How did ZTNA, I think this might have been answered, but s- uh, how did ZTNA improve visibility or control compared to what you had with your VPN-based architecture?
I could say from a visibility and control, um, we have ultimate control over the architecture and ultimate visibility, where we can say if you don't meet all of these criterias or any chunk of these criterias, you can or cannot get to these things. So from a visibility perspective, we can see if a user should have access to something and whether they do right through the AppGate platform. So from a visibility perspective, from a signaling perspective, it's not been we haven't figured out a way to feed that signaling into like a behavior system. But from a visibility perspective, like you have to know what you're giving people if you want to do granular entitlements. And so you know exactly what it's going to take for somebody to get that entitlement. You set that up.
I'd kind of
Thank you.
add to that, the logging out of AppGate is really detailed. So if you send your AppGate logs into a log management platform, there's a lot of insight you can gather from that, both operationally and also from a diagnostic troubleshooting standpoint. Um,
It's been good for
yeah,
reporting for regulators too, because we can show access and who's got access to what and when they accessed it. And it's not just they had access to the network. It's here's exactly what they had access to. That's been very beneficial. And like John, we've been feeding this into a log aggregator and have created all kinds of reporting tools that helps the customer sort of show their work to their examiners and auditors.
yeah. And I'll just add that the logs are in an easily parsable format, which is really appreciated because writing regex parsing rules for some products can be really painful. It's nice to have logs that are thoughtfully generated so that the burden of parsing is minimal. So, thank you.
Of course. Thank you. How has CTNA improved your ability to scale, onboard, or support customers more efficiently than before?
I would say from a work from home perspective, it's made um, that risk sort of story much easier for us to allow folks or have folks working from home, where we can limit the kind of access they have based on their location and based on the kind of equipment they're using. So that's been beneficial for us in that regard.
Cool.
Wonderful. We have one last question here. Did ZTNA help strengthen customer retention or improve your ability to win new business? If so, how?
We
I
actually,
think we talked. I'm
yeah, we
sorry, go ahead.
covered that one, I think, in the session. So I think we should be good there.
Sounds good. I don't see any more questions here. I'm gonna give the audience a minute in case they want to submit something before we close this out. Here's one. If an MSP asks whether ZTNA is worth the effort, what's the one technical or business outcome that convinced you it was the right move?
Well, the business outcome was a attack surface reduction, and I'll tell you right now, it saved us tens or hundreds of hours in maintenance. So, I mean, just off the top of my head, that's the first thing that came to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think the, you know, it, if to me it comes down to defensibility. You know, you know how defendable are the decisions that are made in the future. And I think none of us have a crystal ball. We don't know if a vulnerability is going to be exploited or not. If it's not exploited, it doesn't it doesn't have a direct impact, but it is a risk. And I think that ultimately, you know every business has to be thinking about what their tolerance for risk is and then make decisions that are aligned to that. So I think, if they're deciding, is it worth it? I think they have to think through the scenario of, if they don't do it, what's the likelihood and what's the severity of an adverse outcome, and how does that affect their business? And if they think that that's a low risk, high effort undertaking, then it probably doesn't make sense for them to invest a lot in an architecture or a platform change. We thought it was a high likelihood, high severity kind of risk, and it wasn't one that we were willing to continue to accept. So we made the change. But I think that that's ultimately, the job of the leadership of the organization to decide what's right for them. So, I don't know if that answered the question, but
I think it did. Thank you, John. I'm not seeing any more questions. Corey, I think we're good to close it out if that's okay.
Yep, all set. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you once again to our phenomenal speakers, Andy and John. A special heartfelt thank you to you both for sharing your valuable time and expert insights. And Robert and Corey, thank you as well for your contributions today. To our audience, thank you for being an active and engaged part of today's ZTNA Table Talks. As a friendly reminder, the recording of this session will be shared with you via email tomorrow. We highly value your input, and your feedback is crucial in shaping the future of these ZTNA Table Talks. So before you go, please take us just a moment to complete the short survey that will pop up on your screen when you close the webinar. Thank you one last time for joining us today. We hope you found this session beneficial. And in case we don't connect until next year, we are wishing you all very happy holidays and a happy new year. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.